Hello, thanks for joining me today. My name is Sam Oak. I am the English Learner Coordinator for the Faribault Public School District. Myself, along with my partner, Cassie Onstad, who is the Adult Basic Education Director, put together this series of diversity discussion to talk a little bit about diversity in Faribault, Minnesota, and actually diversity throughout the United States, and try to get deeper understanding of the history of immigration and asylum seekers to the United States, and in particular to our area here in Minnesota and in Faribault. It is a four-part discussion series. In November, we had an exploration of sort of like an immigration 101 to look back at the history of immigration in the United States and really see if there were any difference between immigrants who arrived back in the 1800s and 1900s to our newer refugees and asylum seekers that are arriving today. The second part of the series was titled "Finding Refuge," and we discussed the idea of what makes an immigrant illegal. We looked in depth to the asylum seekers who are coming from Central America today, their stories, and their process for applying for asylum here in the United States that would be particularly true to them or to any other immigrants seeking asylum here in the United States. Then we chose to dive into and take a closer look at refugee resettlement and how we're doing refugee resettlement here, where the rise were and where the reductions were in refugee resettlement. The United States have had a long history resettling refugees in the world. We were the leaders in the world, and the question is that still true today? And then that all culminated to our last series where we broke off into groups and really tried to dive into the question as, with America being the land of immigrants, who does belong in this country and who gets to decide who belongs in this country? The whole series that we do is actually not to try to, is only to present facts and really have our audience come up with their own conclusions about how immigration affects them and their daily life, and we don't try to persuade anybody to take a stand one way or another. So with that introduction here, I'll go ahead and I'll start with showing you our first session, and really it's just a quick summary of what we talked about. You can follow along in the PowerPoint slides that I have here as well. The title of our first session was called Land of Immigrants, and again we just look back at the history of immigration and some of the changes throughout our history as it pertains to immigration laws. And when we did this, we asked our audience to really think about what is similar about what stories are similar from the immigration of today to their stories of their ancestors coming in to the U.S. here earlier on, maybe in the 1800s and 1900s, from all different parts of the world. And also to look at if there is any differences too, and to really think about those differences and think about why there are differences between immigrants back in the 1800s and immigrants who are arriving today. So to start off with, if we're not looking at the Native American story yet, it was really, immigration happened right when explorers and settlers started coming to the United States. In the 1600s, we had immigration from the British Isles. We had, our Spanish speakers coming from Spain, Portuguese explorers as well with that. We had French explorers who came for the fur trade and to try to find resources up and down the Mississippi River. We had Dutch, Russian, and African Americans or Africans at the time brought in as a unique form of immigration that has not been talked about a lot, but it goes under the category not as asylum seekers, refugees, or even just the regular immigrants, but fall under the category of more of what is coined now as imported people to the United States. And unfortunately, in this series here, we won't dive into that very closely, but it is a very interesting topic that I myself am starting to learn more about at the moment. In the 1700s, this is during the time, in the later 1700s, of course, we had the French and Indian War, and that actually brought a lot of French Canadians and French to the area of our modern day United States here. In the 1800s, we had more British immigrants that came in, Irish and Scottish immigrants, German immigrants, or French immigrants, and also more Russians and Mexican immigrants now are also starting to come as well. And if we look back into our history, a lot of things happened during that time. There was westward expansion, and the Louisiana Purchase and the Spanish-American War, all of which took place around this area here too, that is starting to create that diversity in the United States here. And also in the 1800s, particularly to more of the West Coast, we had our Chinese and Japanese immigrants, Hawaii as well, and our interactions with that island kingdom there. And the Scandinavian groups were starting to come in also. In Europe at this time, people were struggling with, the potato famine that really hurt a lot of the residents in Northern Europe, and people that were living in those areas were struggling to survive and came to the United States in search of a better life and opportunities as well. In the 1900s, Scandinavian groups were still continuing to come. We started having more of the Italians, the Greek immigrants, Hungarians, and Slavic people from Eastern Europeans were also coming. The result of World War II brought a lot of Jewish immigrants to the United States, again adding more and more to our diversity. So I talked about some of this stuff already, but some of the events that caused some of our early immigrants to come to the United States were the European settlements. The Lutheran Catholic Wars also took place, so you were having refugees without the proper definition yet at the time also coming in as refugees to the United States here. War against the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula also brought a lot of our Spanish and Portuguese speakers to the United States. The slave trade, people came here for religious freedom that's taught very, I would say, in good amount in our history textbooks. With the Pilgrims immigrating and the Quakers and all that, all for religious freedom. The French and Indian War, indentured servants, the potato famine, the Norwegian famine, and even the Napoleonic Wars that led to the Louisiana Purchase. Continuing on with our immigration timeline, in the early century 1900s and actually the early 2000s here. That slide, I apologize, it was a little messed up. But in the 2000s, we had other refugees from Asia and East Africa that were starting to come. And in the 1980s, after the agreement and the definition on the written in about the Refugee Convention, it gave a definition of what is a refugee, and it brought refugees from Vietnam and Southeast Asia into our country as well. And we still have refugees that are coming from Asia. Recently, our most recent refugees are coming from Burma. The Karen refugees, who the Karen people are a minority tribe in Burma that they're predominantly Christian, and actually until very recently they were the largest group that arrived in Minnesota here. We also have Tibetan refugees. Chin is another Christian minority tribe in Burma as well. They had a small community here in Minnesota, but then a lot of them ended up moving down south to Texas, where there was already a resettled Chin community. The Bhutanese and the Nepalese also came as refugees to the U.S., and some of what you're hearing currently right now in the news are Central American asylum seekers are making their way to the United States, seeking a better life here in the U.S. Of course, we're quite aware of some of the wars that we've fought recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there are new refugees also now coming from the former Soviet Union area with the involvement and conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. Some of the events that have caused this newer round of immigration, the fall of colonialism, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, better known as the Indo-Chinese Wars to the Southeast Asians, the Soviet Union and its fall, the Bosnian and Serbian conflict, the Sudanese Civil War, migrant workers coming in, working in the agricultural fields in the U.S. here, the Somali Civil War, and then, relating to our Central Americans, asylum seekers, it all started with some of our communities coming because of the Mayan genocide in Guatemala and the earthquake in El Salvador, which originally gave them protective status to come to the United States here. If we look at all the displaced people around the world, there are 68.5 million displaced people around the world. 40 million of those people are internally displaced. This is due to drought, famine, people just moving around. The people who went through the Katrina hurricanes were also would be considered then internally displaced people. 25.4 million of the displaced people worldwide are refugees, and then 3.1 million are asylum seekers. Minnesota has a proud tradition of welcoming refugees. Over the past 15 years, Minnesota has welcomed nearly 40,000 refugees through the Refugee Resettlement Program. We're fifth among U.S. states in welcoming refugees to the U.S. As you can see with the graph here, though, that number has declined as of recent. So that concludes our first session in our diversity discussion. And as you hear, some of the reasons that brought the earlier immigrants and refugees to the U.S., and also some of the reasons that brought the newer refugees and immigrants to the U.S. If you can think back to your own immigration stories and where your family heritage came from, were there similar stories of struggles? Were there similar stories and similar actions taken to help them overcome their struggles? What did they lean on, and who did they lean on for support? Those are things that we really want you to ponder over as we go through our series here on immigration and more importantly, talking about diversity here in Faribault.